So on behalf of UCLA, I would like to first of all acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people here at UCLA. My name's Kate Mackintosh. Just over nearly 6 years ago, in the summer of 2018, I came to LA to set up the Promise Institute for Human Rights with Dr. Israelian and the faculty and staff here. And last summer, I left that position and moved to Europe to expand the project and take the Promise Institute overseas. And I'm now Executive Director of the Promise Institute Europe, based between Amsterdam and The Hague. We have an amazing panel with us to discuss climate change and environmental justice. So, turning to the stellar group on my right, next to me here we have Kevin Jon Heller, Professor of International Law and Security at the University of Copenhagen, also the Special Adviser on War Crimes to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. One more thing about Kevin, which is very relevant today, which is that he is currently engaged, he's been asked by the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to draft his policy on prosecuting environmental crimes. So, Kevin, we're really happy and excited to have you with us today. Next to Kevin, we have Paul Polman, Aurora Prize Selection Committee member, business leader, climate and equalities campaigner, and of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, the former CEO of Unilever, who oversaw some really outstanding developments while he was there. There's absolutely no way I can summarise Paul's bio. Please do look it up. But I would like to just pull out that he's co-author of Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, which was a Financial Times Book of the Year, and many of you may well have read it. Finally, last but not least, my UCLA law colleague, William Boyd. William's a professor of law here at UCLA. He's also the faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And since 2009, he served as project lead for the Governor's Climate and Forests Task Force, which is a collaboration of 43 states and provinces, so subnational collaborations, working to develop regulatory frameworks to reduce emissions for deforestation and land use. And as I say, there's a lot more to know about all of these people, so please do look at the bios in your conference materials. So we have an hour. Each of us, actually including me, I was also asked to present. It's not that I'm hogging the microphone, but I'll try and be very short. We'll briefly present a different perspective on what action we think needs to be taken, or at least one type of action that we think needs to be taken to address the climate crisis. And then I'll moderate a conversation between our distinguished panelists, and then I'll open it up for Q&A with all of you. Before we start to discuss solutions, though, I'd like to ask Paul, to turn to Paul and ask you, Paul, to maybe give us some context. So one of Paul's accomplishments is that he was appointed by the UN Secretary General to help draw up the SDGs nearly a decade ago. So I think you're really uniquely positioned, Paul, to talk a little bit about what the problem is.
Yeah. Well, I won't spend too much time on the problem. I think we all are aware of it, but I always say, obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals are a great moral framework that we have to solve problems at a time that nobody seems to be able to work with each other. I always say when adults behave like children and children more and more behave like adults. Fortunately, we have this moral framework called the Sustainable Development Goals. Irreversibly eradicate poverty, do that in a more sustainable and equitable way, and we capture that very simply in the little slogan, leave no one behind. The reality is only 15% of the Sustainable Development Goals are on track right now because of all the things happening in the world, so we need to go into overdrive. By all means possible, by the way. I would argue, and it's a separate talk, that the main ingredient missing is human willpower. I mean, we can get into that in the panel. But anyway, I stand here with a little bit of humanity and humility because you saw the candidates that we have to elect this afternoon, and I'm getting a little bit scared because talking to some of the other friends of mine in the selection committee, I don't know how we're going to do it. It's becoming a moral dilemma for me to say one deserves it more than another. So I hope tonight we'll have the right person, but it also says that the world is blessed with incredible humanitarians, which gives you hope, you know. If we don't keep that hope in front of us, then it's not worth living for, in my opinion. This panel is the panel on climate change and environmental justice. First, I would do a little bit of a small framing, because obviously I was looking at Kate, Kevin, and William, which in their own rights are amazing people. And it's clear on the panel that it might mean different things to different people. Environmental or climate justice for me is not only emphasizing human rights, which we do, but also the just transition, how we do things is very important. You know, you look at globalization, actually it's not a bad thing to globalize things more, but if there are too many people that feel they're not participating or don't have the opportunity to develop within that system, then it automatically will rebel against itself. So on the one hand, we need to reduce without any doubt the punitive impact of climate change, which is a direct relationship on human rights. We've seen that because the most vulnerable groups of society or the minorities are the ones, frankly, that suffer the most. And COVID, I think, was a realization by many people who had been, or probably not been thinking about it. You know, there's something wrong with how the system works here. But it's also an opportunity to rethink how we build this new inclusive and fair economy, as so well demonstrated by the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. Mary Robinson, who isn't here, I was talking to her on the phone, but unfortunately she cannot travel, has the principles of climate justice, and her NGO itself is obviously focused on that. To look at really her 7 principles, if I remember, it's worth looking at it, but I think they're very good to look at. What we'll talk today, perhaps a little bit more in the panel, is not the broader aspects of all the Sustainable Development Goals, but drawing on the expertise of the panel. It's probably more what can we do in international law, international criminal justice systems, or things like ecocide or client Earth and all the other things that are popping up. And frankly, as a former CEO, I'm all for that. It's very clear that you can't move the system anymore if we don't have the right frameworks and laws in place, and if we don't hold people accountable. That accountability is absolutely required to get the trust, but also to create that level playing field. So we'll probably likely focus more on the environmental crimes and then the subsequent human rights abuses in the value chain. I'll get into that later, but I think one of the bigger problems is that we're defining our responsibilities a little bit too small. Most companies and the private sector is a big catalyzer for change here. If we don't get the private sector behind it at scale and at speed, we won't get to any of the targets. You know, I looked at the 117 SDGs or 169 targets. It's about 85 to 90% of them require active involvement of business. And right now, most businesses define their responsibilities too narrowly in what they call scope 1 and 2, which basically is under their own control. But the real impacts of the private sector is in fact in scope 3, which is the value chain. You take climate change, 80% of the emissions are in the value chain itself. You take human rights abuses, it all happens in the value chain. So one of our principles in Net Positive is that the book is called How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, because at the end it is a courage word. Courage comes from the Latin word cor, K-O-R, or the Greek actually, derivative cor. We speak with the mind what comes from the heart. That's why the French have the word cœur as being the heart. You cannot solve these issues, again, in my opinion, if you don't put humanity back in the center of business. With the Milton Friedman era, I don't need to talk to you about, but we've become obsessed with shareholder value. You saw some of that in the panel, actually, just before lunch. The definition of a billionaire seems to be expressed in dollars. I've always liked to think about it of touching 1 billion people, but we seem to have forgotten that, even on some of the comments that were made, in my opinion. So I don't want to be critical there, but it's actually about bringing humanity back to business that we need and taking that broader responsibility. Many of the companies think they can outsource their value chain and also think that they can, by doing so, outsource their responsibilities. That simply doesn't work anymore. So we need to talk that. Climate change is obviously real, but we have to talk both about better understanding who the victims are of climate change, which are showing up in many different areas, but also the perpetrators. And I think what you heard this morning, it's individuals, it's companies, it's governments, sometimes it's communities, and it's all driven by 2 things, protecting a self-interest because it's working, or a simple system of greed, that apathy, selfishness. selflessness. That is basically the disease that we have right now. When we talk about climate change or food insecurity or poverty or deforestation, these are just symptoms. They are not the real issues. The real issues is actually our own behavior, our moral standards and our beliefs. So we can talk about that a little bit. Let me see if the questions that the panelists are going to debate a little bit more are around the areas of are the right legal frameworks in place and the legal systems, that are they being enforced, how we use actively and shape actively the public policy, and what should business do and what role should business play in all of this. As I mentioned, that business should take responsibility for its total impact in society. We also think that it's not only bringing your own house in order if you want to, but that the role of what we would call a net positive business has to go well beyond that. Right now, we're trying in very simple terms to improve systems to make it more palatable by staying within the current system that creates the problems in the first place. It's not going to work. It's the famous definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So businesses need to get collectively together to handle these toughest challenges. Individual businesses alone cannot get there. It's impossible. We have to hold them to account, but it's that collective force, and that collective force increasingly is with different actors in society, that then ultimately needs to translate itself into working the broader systems changes that the panel also alluded to. How do you get the right frameworks in place? A price on carbon is a systems change, if you want to or not. And business needs to move from what I call lobbying. In America, $4.5 billion goes into politics to influence voting, most of it for their own self-interest. I don't know how you call this a democracy, but that's my Dutch directness. But how do you turn that into what I would call positive advocacy, where you work for the common good interest? I think the real leadership, I always say, only starts when people realize that by putting themselves to the service of others, they're actually better off themselves as well. And more businesses start to understand that if the system isn't working, they will not be successful either. There's no business case in enduring poverty. So you probably get that awareness going, but how do you translate that awareness into action? So here we have two possibilities that climate justice can focus on. One is the legal accountability. The number of cases actually have doubled over the last 4 or 5 years. And we're seeing now in every country. The US actually quite active, in my opinion, but also in Europe, the part where I come from, where my own government has been held to account. Companies like Shell have been held to account. And frankly, one of my possibilities with being able to share our success in life with others is to support some of these organizations. I'm a direct believer that needs to happen. Otherwise, it needs to happen much faster and much more aggressive. So you see these wonderful things here, like Montana or Hawaii or Switzerland or other cases popping up now that are actually increasingly starting to win in the courts. And the second thing is the just transition and climate justice. It's not only that we need the legal system, but that we also need to think about how to do it properly. Especially what is a concern to me is the developing markets, because that's 85% of the world's population. We treat them like dirt, to be honest. We don't give them vaccines. We don't give them the 100 billion climate fund. We don't give them technology. Now we don't give them financing to make these transitions. And this is where most of the challenges are happening. It's also where most of the vulnerable people are. I just came 2 days ago from Kenya, and the floods when I was there I was just in Nairobi, but within the 40 hours that I was there, 48 hours I was there, over 200 people lost their lives. I come back to Europe, nobody was aware of it. Like sort of, where have you been, what happened there? It doesn't even hit the news anymore. So it's the vulnerable people, and that's what we call just transition, in my opinion, or climate justice. So we talked about that, the role of the private sector, the getting involved in the political process and de-risking that, and then working on what hopefully is making come alive the UN principles of where states have the duty to protect human rights, where business has the responsibility to respect human rights, and where the victims need to be addressed with effective remedy. I was very fortunate to have as a dear friend John Ruggie, and when we developed in 2011 basically the Ruggie principles that you're familiar with, we created the business and human rights principles, which I think are very, very powerful. I chair the UN Global Compact for the Secretary General, but one of the first things we always do is, within the 10 principles, is hold business accountable. when you have a disaster unfolding, like a city like Nagorno-Karabakh of 120,000 people being chased away with these geopolitical tensions, that's a human rights issue, that's a genocide issue. Any business that operates there should know that they are part of these value chains. What are they doing about it? And the same for other parts of the world where these atrocities are happening. So that's really what it is. I'd like to frame since I came from Kenya, I'd probably like to frame the panel, in my opinion, around two things. The practical, so what do we do about it, and what are some of the action steps we can take, but more importantly, to make us think about the morality and the responsibility that we have there. That's really where the real emphasis needs to be and where the solutions lie. And it was really, coming back from Kenya, a wonderful woman who won the Nobel Prize, Wangari Maathai, who said it very well when she said that in the course of history, there comes a time that humanity is called upon to rise to a higher level of consciousness, a higher moral ground. So I cannot think of a better way to start this panel than saying that time is now. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Well, I think that's actually a great, thank you very much for the framing, and it's also a very great kicking off point for the argument I want to introduce, which is that massive destruction of our environment should be an international crime. So there are currently 4 international crimes that can be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of aggression, which is essentially one state invading another. So I want to propose, today I'm sharing with you the proposal, which is not something that I own, that there should be a 5th crime, the crime of ecocide. So the idea of the crime of ecocide is that individuals would be held responsible for acts and emissions which cause massive destruction. And I consider that that could be a small lever that could have really quite significant impact, perhaps particularly on corporate actors. Why an international crime? An international crime is essentially something which we as a global community have decided is so egregious that we can't leave it to the discretion of individual states to regulate, right? We've taken it out of the hands of individual states and we've said all of us think this is an international crime. And we're also saying that it's acts that wherever they're committed are crimes against all of us. So that idea is captured very well in crimes against humanity. Wherever this crime is committed, it's a crime against us all. So the crime of genocide is not just a crime against that human group, which the person committing genocide is trying to eliminate. It's a crime against all of us. We are all poorer if an individual human group is eliminated or if there are attempts to eliminate it. And it seems to me, what could be more obviously a crime against all of us than destruction of our common environment? So that's the argument and basically the moral logic, to come back to the issue that Paul raised, behind the creation of an international crime of ecocide. So that's not actually just an idea, and perhaps you could put the slide up, AV people. From 2020 to 2021, I was part of this independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. So there were 12 of us, as you can see. The panel was chaired by Philippe Sands, who's in the middle on the bottom, and Dior Falsao on the right there from Senegal and the UK. I was a deputy chair of the panel, but it was a fantastic group. We also had over there on the left a former ICC, International Criminal Court judge from Samoa, for example. There's a climate lawyer from Norway. There's Charles Jallo, the member of the International Law Commission from Sierra Leone. It was a really interesting group, and we worked together over a period of 6 months, and we issued our proposed definition of ecocide, which we crafted so that it could be proposed as an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and could be brought into law as the 5th crime. I don't want to go into the details. I did put a slide up, which maybe it's interesting. You could put the next slide up just to show you what basically we suggested that the crime should be. This was our definition. I can talk about that for hours and it will get really dull. But essentially, our point would be anybody whose actions can be, who know that there was a substantial risk that their actions would cause severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment would be potentially guilty of ecocide, and then that individual could be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. And I say, as I mentioned earlier, I think this could really make a difference, and I think it's most likely to make a difference with corporate actors. I think the deterrent effect of being potentially even investigated, let alone indicted, prosecuted, or convicted for a crime of ecocide, and I'd be very interested to hear Paul's opinion on this, but I think it would really make a difference in boardroom conversations, in businesses deciding how to act. If there's a risk, if their in-house legal counsel advises them that they could potentially be in the frame for ecocide, I would imagine that that would be something that could really change decisions in a way that the current international crimes, genocide, war crimes, etc., have far less of a deterrent impact on political actors who are mobilized, who are motivated by more ideological and political, and maybe even we could say emotional rationale, which is less susceptible to being deterred by potential prosecution. So that's my proposal, that's my solution for one way in which we should be addressing the ecological crisis that we're in. There hasn't yet been a proposal to amend the statute, although we are hopeful that maybe this year, in December, there's the annual meeting of the states that are parties to the International Criminal Court, and we think that this might be the year that this amendment is introduced. But meanwhile, we've seen really interesting developments at national and regional level. So Belgium, for example, has just revised its national criminal code, and it's included the crime of ecocide, and it's almost exactly our proposed definition. The European Parliament has also approved Environmental Crimes Directive, which actually has come into force now 2 weeks ago, which means that every member state of the EU has 2 years to bring their national laws into line, and that Environmental Crimes Directive also includes what they call an aggravated or qualified offence, also in similar terms to this. And since in the last year, I have to check my notes because there are quite a lot, in the last year, a national crime of ecocide is being proposed by parliamentarians or announced in Brazil, the Netherlands, Scotland, Spain, Mexico, Italy, and the United Kingdom in just the last year. So that's my proposal. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Kevin, who's going to be able to talk much more broadly about international criminal law and the role it can play in his current role as advisor to the ICC prosecutor. So Kevin, thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, so in mid-February of this year, my boss, Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, he publicly announced in Paris at a meeting of judges that the office was going to develop a policy concerning the prosecution of environmental crimes. He said, "Damage to the environment poses an existential threat to all life on the planet. For that reason, I am firmly committed to ensuring that my office systematically addresses environmental crimes in all stages of its work, from preliminary examinations to prosecutions." Now, this wasn't the first time that the Office of the Prosecutor had mentioned environmental crimes. There was a policy paper in 2016, a mention that the prosecutor would foreground environmental destruction, the illegal theft of natural resources, the dispossession of land, and so on. But as Karim said to a reporter in Paris, that was a sentence. This is a policy. And so, as Kate kindly mentioned, I'm actually co-authoring the new policy for the office. I'm working with a fantastic appellate attorney named Reinhold Gallmetzer, who actually started the Center for Climate Crime Analysis, which is a really important NGO that does kind of data-driven analysis of environmental damage. And really, there's two motivations for developing this policy. And one I don't have to dwell on because everybody in the room will agree that there is, in fact, an existential crisis caused by climate change, and that environmental damage is truly one of the most important threats that we have to address. The second consideration, and it kind of articulates well with the two talks before me, is that there is a need for international prosecutions of environmental crimes. There are plenty of efforts at the national and regional level to deal with environmental crimes, but it is not yet, hopefully it will get better, a particularly strong system. Very few states have robust criminal law governing environmental destruction. Some don't even deem environmental destruction unlawful, much less criminal. some states that do actually have the crimes on the books, often you find the government themselves being complicit in the acts that cause environmental damage. And so clearly the domestic criminal law system can't be relied upon to deal with those kinds of crimes. And then finally, even when they have the crimes and they have the will, some states are simply not powerful enough to take on the kinds of interests that are responsible for environmental damage. And here, of course, we are thinking about multinational corporations. Many states, particularly in the global south, just simply don't have the resources to mount an effective prosecution of a major multinational corporation. So I want to spend what little time I have focusing on what the policy paper is actually about and what it's going to do. But I do want to acknowledge very briefly two important limitations. The first is that we are bound by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the treaty that created the court. We can only prosecute environmentally damaging acts insofar as we can legally qualify them as war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, or aggression. We don't have jurisdiction over ecocide. We're not going to be prosecuting ecocide, but of course, if states ever decided to amend the Rome Statute to incorporate ecocide, then we would incorporate that crime into
when they decide to.
When. The second limit, and I think this needs to be also just kind of openly acknowledged, is that the Rome Statute is a fundamentally anthropocentric document. There is only one crime in the Rome Statute, the war crime of causing disproportionate damage to the environment during an otherwise lawful attack, that is truly ecocentric, that really views nature as an end in itself. So normally we will be limited to prosecuting environmentally damaging acts that have at least some adverse impact on individuals and human groups. So what can we do, and how can we do it? We divide the policy paper into three sections to answer those questions, and I just want to briefly touch on all three. So the first section is simply definitional. We define an environmental crime as a crime under the Rome Statute that is committed either by means of or that results in environmental damage. And then we define environmental damage as any loss or deterioration of the natural environment, understood to include the Earth's biosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. And we also emphasize that by loss and deterioration, we do include the impact on the health and well-being of flora and fauna, not just simply on humans. So when we're assessing the gravity of a crime, we can take into account the effects on the non-human environment. So then the second section of the policy paper is really where the meat is. It explains, well, I'm a vegetarian, that's a terrible metaphor, isn't it? The second section explains precisely how environmental damage can qualify as a war crime or crime against humanity or genocide. So in terms of genocide, we emphasize the form of genocide that involves deliberately inflicting on a protected group, quote, conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Destroying the natural environment is one way to inflict those kinds of conditions. And if you look at our prosecution of Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, the genocide charges that he faces include conditions of life, genocide. We focus on the destruction of crops, poisoning of wells, poisoning of water supplies, the theft of land. That is a genocide in Darfur against the Fur, the Masalit, and the Zagawa that really is carried out through destroying the environment. In terms of crimes against humanity, we emphasize the crime against humanity of extermination, of deportation or forcible transfer, and persecution. So in some situations, a perpetrator may unlawfully coerce a group to leave an area in order to obtain access to a valuable natural resource. Or, in some situations, a perpetrator may drive a group out of their homes by poisoning the environment, and do so very deliberately. Such actions can sometimes qualify as the crime against humanity of forcible transfer or deportation, and when it really is targeting a specific cognizable group, racial, ethnic, indigenous, tribal, etc., it can also qualify as the crime against humanity of persecution. Finally, then, in terms of war crimes, we focus on the wanton destruction and appropriation of property, starvation, intentional attacks against civilian objects, because the environment is, by default, itself a civilian object. And so think about the war crime of wanton destruction of property. That would include a state's armed forces deliberately destroying a civilian dam, knowing that the environmental consequences would be massive. And of course, we're thinking of the Russian attack on the Kharkova Dam in Ukraine. That's precisely the kind of environmentally damaging act that could, in fact, in the context of an armed conflict, be a war crime. So that's the kind of thing we would look at there. Then the third and final section of the policy paper, it really discusses how we're actually going to put these policies into practice. And I don't have time to go into any great detail, but let me just finish by flagging kind of three, I think, really important aspects of how we're going to operationalize the policy. And the first, and I really want to emphasize this, is that we will always take an intersectional approach to environmental crimes. We will recognize that such crimes, of course, like environmental damage more generally, has a disproportionate effect on women, on children, on members of indigenous communities. We will always work with our policy in the context of all of the other policies that we have about protecting the most vulnerable. Second, we will prioritize what the office calls the principle of complementarity. We will use our resources as best we can to facilitate national prosecutions of environmental crimes. We will share the evidence that we obtain. We will serve as a node to transfer evidence between states that need to deal with environmental crime, because as we all know, they often tend to be transnational. So we will really try, because of how limited we are in what we can do, to facilitate a development of a robust national criminal law response. And then third and finally, we will emphasize the prosecution of environmental crimes committed by corporations, not Unilever, of course. The court doesn't have jurisdiction over legal persons. We only have jurisdiction over natural persons, but that certainly means that we can go after an individual corporate officer of a corporation that is responsible for environmental damage. And in fact, doing so is really one of the key ways to hopefully to deter corporations in the future from committing more environmental crimes. So let me just end with a note of honesty. We are just one international court. We have limited resources. We are constantly overstretched with unfortunately, all of the conflicts that go on in the world. So we're not a panacea. We're not going to fundamentally change the landscape of environmental damage. But we will and we can prosecute environmental crimes whenever possible, and we will encourage states to do likewise. And we really do firmly believe that those efforts can be an important part of a much larger mosaic of efforts to deal with the environmentally damaging effects of various actions. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you. Okay, William, I think we're maybe going to get a little more granular. Let's see. So you're recently back from Bolivia, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
What can you tell us about crime and illegality on the tropical forest frontier, and what are your thoughts about how that should be addressed?
Yeah. So thanks, Kate, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here, and thanks to Paul and Kevin as well, and to Promise and Aurora. So I do want to get a little more granular and talk a bit about environmental destruction and crime in the context of tropical deforestation. And I think that's a place where issues of land claims, climate change, human rights, indigenous rights, economic and environmental justice really collide. And I think it's an important sort of case study to kind of think about some of these broader issues. I want to do a little context setting first before I get into kind of the meat of what I want to say, and I'll be brief. Deforestation, the vast majority of which happens in the tropics, is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's been stubbornly persistent over the last 2 decades. It was down slightly last year because of big reductions in Brazil and Colombia. But we're losing roughly 10 soccer pitches a minute in terms of intact tropical forests. It's about 2.5 billion tons of CO2, and that's roughly half of U.S. emissions on an annual basis. So it's a big part of the climate change challenge. Obviously, forests are important sinks for sequestering or removing carbon from the atmosphere as well. So when you clear tropical forests, you not only emit, but you also are destroying the sink. They're extremely biodiverse. About half the world's terrestrial biodiversity, according to some estimates, are in tropical forest. Many of the world's remaining indigenous communities are in tropical forest. About 1.5 billion people get sort of direct livelihoods from tropical forest. Most of the rest of us, of course, benefit from the regional and global environmental services of tropical forest. Tropical deforestation, I don't need to remind you, has been a major global concern for 40 plus years. You know, ever since the early Landsat images of deforestation in Brazil in the early 80s, it has been on the international agenda, and we've tried all kinds of things, including various approaches within climate policy. None of this has really worked at scale, although there are some interesting things out there that are working in various ways. And I will say that companies like Unilever under Paul Polman did some really important, amazing stuff in terms of their supply chain work in places like Indonesia. Maybe we can get into that in the discussion. Now, it is also the case that tropical forests and tropical frontiers have long been sites of dispossession, displacement, criminal activity, and violence. This is getting worse, not better, in some places, certain parts of the Amazon. Recent years have seen a major increase in what some are calling convergent environmental crimes, again, particularly in parts of the Amazon, where organized criminal groups, narco-traffickers, and others are diversifying into various activities: drugs, illegal gold mining, land speculation, money laundering, right? All of this is connected in various ways, and it's organized and transnational increasingly. So it's a huge challenge. And so maintaining rule of law was always hard on these tropical frontiers, and I think is getting harder in many places. In some parts of Colombia, for example, the former FARC rebels and narco-traffickers essentially control the territory, and they can turn deforestation off, as they did in 2023, and they can turn it back on, as they've done in 2024, so deforestation is now going back up in Colombia quite a bit. Why is all of this happening? There's a lot going on here at multiple levels. There's no single explanation, right? Different things are happening in different places for sure. If we look at Brazil specifically, right, it is clear that the Bolsonaro government created a power vacuum, and organized criminal networks moved in and consolidated power, and then diversified into various environmental crimes. The big question now, I think, is whether these new illicit economies have become so entrenched, right, that it's almost impossible to eradicate. We don't know. We've never really sort of confronted this, right? I think, and this is where I may differ from my ecocide colleagues a little bit, believe me, I'm all for ecocide if we can, you know, go after certain individuals, companies, or whatever, right? But I think it's a mistake to blame all of this on Bolsonaro, or at least it's a mistake to stop there, because I think we have to look at the underlying conditions, right, that enabled this to happen in the first place. You could say the same thing about our politics here in the United States and, you know, certain personalities, but I think we've got to dig into the economic logic on the ground a bit and think about why this particular type of dynamic unfolded as rapidly as it did. And basically, there's no real economy in many of the small municipalities across the Western Amazon, right? There are people living on meager transfer payments from the federal government and then looking for whatever side hustle they can find. And oftentimes that side hustle involves illegal activity, right? And so thinking about that logic, I think, becomes a really important part of the deforestation challenge. It is not the only dynamic by any stretch. There are a lot of other things we can do with big commodities and other drivers in other places, but this particular issue, I think, raises environmental crimes in a very serious way. What can we do about it? Now, command and control and law enforcement clearly can help in the short term. That is why deforestation has gone down dramatically under Lula in Brazil. But that's a short-term solution, right? It's not a long-term strategy, right? So we have to think about creating space for new investments, both public and private, to create alternative livelihoods, to create new forest economies and not allow these illicit economies to become the forest economy, right? There's no real alternative to doing that. We just have to, you know, get together, I think, cooperate at all levels, and public and private need to be working on this. I'm less convinced that ecocide, international criminal law, and even human rights will have much of an impact on this dynamic, though I do think it's very important. And I do think it has more than just symbolic or normative, right, effect in the long run. I do think there's a real sort of legal effect there in the long run, but I think we have to really realize that there's a state of emergency here that we need to deal with, right? I'm skeptical about prospects of climate policy solutions and all the enthusiasm for carbon offsets and carbon finance and how that trickles down to people on the ground and changing behavior. We've been trying that for a long time. It may work in some places, but I think it's limited at best. sustainable supply chains, and again, Paul Polman knows more about this than anybody in this room. For sure that can work in some places, getting deforestation out of global supply chains for big commodities like palm, soy, beef, etc. But these commodities are not the real drivers on these particular frontiers that I'm talking about, right? And there are a whole bunch of domestic supply chain issues that are harder to get at for the big multinationals, right? More generally, I do think that the private sector can and must play a really important role in stepping up and signaling that they are courageous, that they are ready to invest in these new forest economies, if we can mobilize law and government and the public sector to create the stable environment for that to happen. And that's a massive coordination problem happening at multiple levels. One big concern, and I'll close with this, is that these governments, particularly at the subnational level where I work, state and provincial governments, they don't have the capacity, and they are highly constrained in the current environment given massive debt burdens and stagnant economies coming out of the pandemic. And so we need to be thinking about how to strengthen that capacity, connect civil servants and civil society partners to really kind of hold these governments together so that we can create the conditions for the longer term investments in these new forest economies.
Thank you very much, William. Yeah. Super thoughtful and, slightly overwhelming in detail presentation of the challenge. And absolutely, I don't think, the eco side is no way a silver bullet. It's really a parameter. Yeah. And all of what you've highlighted obviously has to happen too. Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, on what William's just shared with us.
Well, very briefly, because I'd love to hear from them, probably the audience, a little bit more what's on their minds. But a lot of things that you say, I agree with. I think we've lost two things in society a little bit that underpin this. So I want to go back to the human side. The first thing I've sort of made myself believe that we have a false feeling that we're more connected, but we're actually more lonely. The connection is on the internet and little likes and little hearts, and we commit suicide if we don't have enough. But the real person probably has only one or two friends they can talk to for real issues. So we're more and more distant from each other. And the second thing is we're all hiding in these concrete bastions that we call Los Angeles and other things. The average kid has forgotten where a banana comes from, or the difference between a cucumber and an aubergine. We have distanced ourselves from nature. So here we have made the two biggest mistakes. We distance ourselves from who we are with each other, and we distance ourselves from who we are with integral part of nature. So if we don't get that back, we won't solve the issues. That awareness is much more important than some of the solutions. Hubert Reeves, who was a philosopher in Canada, said it very well. When in one of his books, he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature. Not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And I'm sure that Hubert deliberately said he instead of she, because she probably wouldn't have done it. But so there is not one solution, but what we found in Unilever, for example, you take the palm oil issue that you referred to as a really wicked challenge, or the deforestation is a really tough challenge. So there is not one solution, but first of all, I think business now is starting to realize that the current destructive, extractive system is not sustainable anymore. The costs that are being sent to businesses are just simply too high. So the argument of the shareholder and maximizing shareholder return is actually now starting to converge with the multi-stakeholder doing something about it. Because so it's sad that we are at that point. I find myself, we shouldn't have been at this point, but because we waited so long, it becomes a very attractive business opportunity. The nature provides $42 trillion of service. I would argue infinite dollars of service, but we measure what business has in their value chain that they get for free: the clean air, the clean water, the natural resources that come from the forest, the oceans, etc. But if you increasingly destroy this, businesses are starting to realize that these costs are just simply too high. In Unilever, when I was running it, we had 400 to 600 million in supply chain disruptions that are directly associated with climate change. That just alone, and then the numbers are higher. So you need all of it. What we did in Indonesia was we created a roundtable of sustainable palm oil. Got a lot of critique because people think you're greenwashing. You know, these things take time, and since you create something, people expect miracles. So you have to withstand that pressure that comes from also the NGO community and from the learnings and adjusting to that. And that was a painful process because these attacks are often on a personal nature. You have to organize the industry. We created the Global Consumer Goods Forum, which is all the retailers and manufacturers, and move the floor up. Never fast enough, but better to move the floor up than leaving it down there. We had to create an organization much more specific, which is called the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is hosted at the WEF. Declarations with governments we work, like the New York Declaration on Forest. All to say is this awareness and this collective responsibility was moved to a higher level. But I believe in Indonesia, for example, the palm oil issue was basically moving in the right direction now because the government was convinced in the end that they needed to put enforcement in place, which was called a moratorium, but there's more to it, restoration of peatland, etc. But the real breakthrough was when I was with the Prime Minister of Singapore, Prime Minister Lee. He said, Paul, you know, what can we do? We're just a small little country. We're Singapore, you know. It's not our problem. I said, well, it is your problem because your people are dying from the smoke that hangs over your country. Then it becomes your problem if you don't do anything about it because, you know, you can. It turned out that all these barons of the palm oil industry were living in Singapore because tax-wise it was the most advantageous place to live. So when they passed the law that held them criminally liable to the smoke that was coming in Indonesia, I remember the Shangri-La where we were all sitting around the table. I was the only one that was even close to being a billionaire, but they got frightened. So call it ecocide laws or call it whatever you want. That regulation at the end of the day is important. And if business feels, certainly the CEOs, that they're being held personally responsible, I think that's a good thing because they should be. If they don't feel personally responsible, they shouldn't be a CEO.
Paul, I'm going to interrupt also because I love what you just ended on, but unless you want to just wrap it up.
I think that's it. It's a combination. It's hard work where you need to pull a lot of these strings to move it forward, and I think that's what you were saying as well.
Thanks. I want to open up to questions, take a few questions, and then, okay. I had one over here first of all.
I'm a former environmental lawyer internationally, and I'm kind of puzzled by the fact that while the lofty goal of Kevin and ICJ is good, but in reality, given the fact that the U.S., Russia, and China are not member of ICJ, and so there's really no jurisdiction of the multinational company.
Thank you. Let's take another one. Yes, lady at the front.
I ask you how we can implement this law, because the one who destroys is the one who are decision.
Thank you.
And even if we have this, now we have Rwanda and Uganda who destroy our environment situation, forest and all. And they are protected by American, by British, by how we can help bring those people together.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more. Oh, wow. I'm going to take two more questions. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much. My question is about definition of the crime of ecocide. It says there that it's a crime done with a knowledge that it damages. So what if it's the same crime done without the knowledge? Isn't it too risky to include the knowledge element, or maybe it should be said with or without knowledge?
Thank you. And then, yes.
I just wanted to follow up on the corporate accountability mechanism. It's getting pretty well documented now that the system of fines isn't working. It's just built into the cost of doing the business. So I was wondering if Paul could dig deeper into how we can actually create an accountability mechanism for CEOs in this country.
Amazing. Last question then. Sorry.
I have a different approach to whatever was said here, especially when Mr. Paul Polman mentioned about over 100,000 people were forced from their motherland, which they lived thousands of years, literally on gunpoint. And these people, on a governmental level, using the quasi or activists, eco-activists, and using the idea of your beautiful idea about the ecocide, they use the term in order to organize the genocide.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much.
What are we going to do about that?
Okay, what are we going to do about that? Okay, I'm going to just take those questions, and I think we can go along and please answer anything that you would like from what was just raised. Williams, let's start with you.
Well, I don't know that many were directed to what I said, but I will say one thing about this question of, the state being responsible for much of the destruction. So that is the government that is in charge of the laws is actually causing a lot of the problem. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in Brazil in particular, the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Finance are now working together to sort of follow the money for a lot of these criminal networks. And this is going to ultimately lead or implicate some people in very sort of high-level positions within the Brazilian government, most likely. And I think that's going to raise some really hard questions about, how serious they are about accountability within their governments. I think this is a problem in all governments at all levels, North and South, for sure. And I think we need to be thinking long and hard about how civil society can be mobilized and the legal system more generally mobilized to deal with that. I don't have any great solutions there.
Paul, on the corporate accountability mechanism in particular.
So we have to defend why don't you, but what gives you the right to do is the much more important question we need to ask. This planet has been there 4.5 billion years. If I put it on 45 years to make it simple, human beings have been here only for 4 hours. The Industrial Revolution started 1 minute ago, and in this 1 minute we destroyed half the world's forest. We lost 68% of the world's species, mammals, vertebrates, birds, whatever you have. I mean, it's incredible what we have done in the last 50 years, basically, that I'm talking about, and deprived others and future generations, which are the most important stakeholders next to planet Earth, from these things. So the knowledge, the lack of knowledge argument, Arman, I don't think is there anymore. It's like CEOs, I didn't realize we only had 10% women in senior management. Give me a break, this whole concept, huh?
That's in the law proposed.
Yeah, but this extended producer responsibility is a very important thing. There's something in the world that at least I grew up in. If you break it, you own it. So just the whole fact that we accept that we can make money by having others now literally lose their lives. So this is not only ecocide. This is crime against humanity, and nature is an important element now that has come in. Thank God. But I say to business leaders, etc., you don't want to attack climate change, but it's a fact that 8 million people die every year prematurely because of air pollution. Do you want to be part of that? So are you literally killing people to make off the back of that some of your money? Is that the right way to earn? So it is at that moral level that you need to drive it. Now, there is an important thing practically. There is enough business, I think, you can put together to create tipping points. So I used to get frustrated by why doesn't anybody get it, and why doesn't everybody behave like this? But that's just the reality of life. But if you can get a small group of people, sometimes 5 or 10% of an industry together, which is what I focus on now, across a value chain with CEOs, you can create tipping points. We got the nature restoration law in Europe because enough businesses spoke up. Perhaps only 5 or 10% of businesses, but these were the moral forces that held governments to a higher account.
Okay, I'm getting a nasty flashing light and even somebody waving for me at the back of the room now.
Yeah, we see you waving. You look familiar, but I didn't quite get it.
No, I'm just a fun police.
But so you see much more now, I think, what I would call this positive advocacy, where you need to create a certain group of people to come together to actually move governments forward. It is, I've come to believe that it is unrealistic to blame governments for a system that is gridlocked exactly because we haven't addressed these issues in the first place. That's why you see populism, xenophobia, and nationalism. So business now has that responsibility to fill that void and give the governments courage, actually, to move these things forward. So I'm advising Ngozi now on the WTO, which is a gridlock system. The US has a lot to do with that, by the way. in there, and but it's a gridlock system. So how can business come in and say, guys, what you are negotiating, we're already doing because it makes business sense, makes sense for the world.
Okay, I'm getting
De-risk that political process.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think I'm just going to give 30 seconds to Kevin to answer all the other legal questions.
I can totally do.
Yeah.
So I mean, the thing to know about international criminal law is it's both extremely powerful and extremely weak. It's extremely powerful because fines are not enough. They can fine them 19 billion. They can fight it in court for 20 years. But even if they had to pay it, that wouldn't put Shell or Chevron out of business. So it's strong to put people in jail or to threaten to put people in jail. But it's also very weak. The International Criminal Court is a treaty-based court. States choose to join it or not join it, and many powerful states haven't. But I'll just end by saying, we do have jurisdiction over any crime that is committed on the territory of a state party. It doesn't matter whether the perpetrator is a national of a state that hasn't joined the court. That's why we have jurisdiction over Putin, because his forces have committed crimes in Ukraine. The reason we can prosecute crimes in Gaza is because Palestine, the state of Palestine, is a member of the court. And so we are limited by the statute that we have, but it does allow us to do a lot of things. And again, the threat of criminal prosecution is a very powerful deterrent.
And you would be able to prosecute also government leaders to answer your questions. So international criminal law could do something towards prosecuting the people who are in charge. I'm really sorry about everyone else who had great questions and people who felt their questions weren't answered. Thank you so much for coming, for your participation. Can I have a last round of applause for the fantastic panel? Thank you.